Hi, a warm welcome, really warm, getting warm in Stockholm, to Startup Grind community. First, let's start from the start. Tell us a bit about yourself and your entrepreneurship journey so far. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you, Naimol, and thank you for inviting me to this fireside chat. So my name is Hugo Wernhoff. I'm 36 years old. Started two edtech companies, and I'm now the co-founder and CEO of Kognity, which is a fast-growing B2B SaaS company. We build a comprehensive learning and teaching tool for schools around the world. We have school customers in about 120 countries, a bit more than 100 employees, growing 40-50% per year. Most of our revenues come from the US, China, Southeast Asia, Central, and the Middle East, but it's really spread out all over. What I tend to focus most on in my work is recruitment, culture, and the longer term future for both product and markets. Other than that, I have a small baby at home, a wife, a dog. I love nature, running, and working with learning.
Okay. Great to hear, and congratulations on the baby. Yeah, it's a start of a new experience. If we, how does your typical day work like in Cognity and in the ventures that you're doing? How does it go about?
I'd say some of my old routines sort of broke down a little bit after I got a baby one month ago, and I'm still putting up new ones. But typically, I get up at around 6 a.m., spend some time with the family, do some sort of exercise, whether it's at the gym or go for a run. Thereafter, there's a work day with 5 to 6 hours of meetings approximately on average. Try to mix both meetings with the internal meetings with meeting with potential advisors, potential recruits, and so on. At some point during the day, I also try to take some alone time to go for a walk and just reflect, and then go to bed around 9:30 or 10.
Meetings are a big part of your day. How do you move through them? Like, does it become very confusing at times, because moving from one mindset to another one, from one agenda to another one, from strategy operations, how do you kind of juggle it?
It's a great question, and you do get used to context switching, and I think the CEO job requires constant context switching. But of course, it can take a toll on energy. I don't know if I found a good way specifically to cope with it, to be honest. I think I just sort of go with the flow. I try to put in work blocks to have some time for actual work. I try to decrease the volume of meeting, but that's been a constant struggle for me for the past 5 years of just having too many meetings. At times it's been up towards 8 or 9 hours per day. Now it's down at 6 or 7, but of course a lot of the meetings generate actions as well, and you have to find time to do those. And you also don't want to get stuck in only a reactive work mode. You also make sure that you have time to think about where should we take this business, what should we reshape, and generally, as a CEO, you have to have the ability to be proactively planning and thinking rather than being reactive to communication or to what happens around you. So that's something you have to build some sort of methodology and structure to be able to deal with.
Okay, great. But you talked about like working proactively, taking some alone time. Just trying to understand, dig deep into that. As a startup scales up and the momentum increases, does it mean that the focus is more and more on operations, even for the CEO, or is it that you get more resources into team with investors potential, which can jump into the strategizing mode? How does does strategy take a back seat, or kind of starts moving there as the startup scales up? Some feedback, if you can build in something.
Yeah, very, very good question. I think that is what happens unless you take control of it. unless you take control of your work situation, because all of a sudden you don't have one other stakeholder,
Mm.
your co-founder, but you have hundreds. You have, of course, the team, and you have investors, you have partners, customers, all of these people who you want to give attention to, and it very easily eats up all your time.
Mm.
And you have to counter that by not least hiring a great team that you can delegate entire areas of responsibility to, but also be very mindful of how you spend your time, block out time in your calendar to take a step back without any technology, without access to email or Slack or your phone. Sit with a notebook and think about the big questions for your business. What actually matters? Where do I want to take the business?
Mm.
Why do I want to take the business there? What gives me energy? What takes energy from me? How can I redesign my work life, and what should I make sure to really drive and really push in the business? I think it has to be a conscious effort in order to be able to still strategize with good quality, because it's otherwise you won't have time for it.
Excellent. I really latched on to the point that you mentioned, and I'll just point to the community. Great point from Hugo. Like, you need to be watchful if you are building your startup, or if you have already built a startup and on the second or the third startup, depends on where you are. But if you're building a startup, be watchful of the energy. And as Hugo was saying, what gives you energy and where can you put your energy? It's an energy exchange as an entrepreneur. So that's a great point. Coming back to, because you said that hundreds of people are eventually there once your journey starts succeeding and people come in. You initially started by talking about recruitment and culture being high on your plate and agenda. Um, as a founder who comes up with an idea and can dream through that idea for the next 10-15 years, how do you get hundreds of people around a similar vision with the same passion and drive when you're recruiting people? How what's the magic over there?
I don't know if there's any magic, but I guess it's hard work. You have to spend a lot of time recruiting to
Mhm.
really find the stars. You have to work hard to understand what kind of profile could deliver magic for
Mhm.
this specific need that our business has. What
Mhm.
kind of perspectives, experiences, attitude could take us to the next level, so that you're able to fully let go of full mandates
Mhm.
to them and hand those out. Um, but then once you have that team in place, which is I think the most important thing, to get the right team in place and to continuously refine how you think about what the right team is,
Mhm.
you have to have alignment tools. And the two biggest alignment tools for us as a company are our vision, because we're very clear on where we want to go, what impact we want to create
Mhm.
for individuals around the world, for societies around the world, and we think we can make a massive impact. That's a
Mhm.
big reason of why a lot of people are at Cognity, because they believe in our ability to create a real paradigm shift in learning efficacy for students around the world. So that's a great alignment tool, which creates this common drive, this alignment, this fire within us, not only as individuals, but in us as a team. And then the second alignment tool that we have is our values.
Mhm.
And very consciously uh, building a culture that we believe is the best one for sustainable, high performance. We've done that since day one, because culture always happens to any company, and you can either design it or let it be designed haphazardly. And we decided to design it, and I think that has paid a lot of dividends now as we've started to grow. It's a much more scalable
Mhm.
management tool than simply having direct one-to-one contact or trying to feedback certain behaviors that you see. It's so much easier to, from the get-go, have said that this is the framework within which we work. This is how we collaborate. This is how we communicate. This is how we have fun together. This is how we reach results together. So those two things, once you first get the team in place, then have an aligned goal in the organization, and you have a way of working that everyone buys into.
Okay, great points. Again, for our community, vision and values, the two V's being there, trying to focus on that, and then alignment. Uh, the world is almost coming out. We have come out almost of the pandemic and everything. How did these 1.5 to 2 years go? Did it have any effect on the culture, the working styles, like, or did or would like to know a little bit about how did Cognity come out of it, and how was the experience? Any learnings there?
Yeah, yeah, sure. If we start with looking at our market, so we
Mm,
sell a tool that replaces printed textbooks at
mm,
schools. And of course, with all schools in the world, or most schools in the world, needing to go digital more or less overnight,
mm,
there was a surge of demand for our product, and we helped by supplying this to schools for free in the early days for schools that went into lockdown around the world.
mm,
And we could really get a much larger reach for our impact. So that was good to, in all that chaos that the first couple of months of the pandemic
mm,
was, to still feel that we could play a role in making sure that students continued learning and schools could continue to operate. So from a business point of view, it was a good opportunity to showcase what we do, and EdTech has accelerated heavily since the pandemic and because of the pandemic generally. From a cultural point of view, it's sort of been like living in Sweden, you don't realize what a big impact the darkness and cold has on you until you reach spring. And now we're in the end of April, and we're starting to see some sunshine, temperatures go up,
mm.
and we realize that how much we missed it and what a big impact it has on our well-being and also productivity. It's been exactly the same thing with the pandemic for us. We have a fully flexible setup, so you can work from wherever, you can work from home as much as you want and when you want. But still, a lot of people choose to go into the office, and for me personally, and I think for a lot of my colleagues, there has been that shift
Mm.
that now that we're back, we realize how much we missed spending time with each other and how much it does for our culture and sense of togetherness.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that experience, and both the business side and the culture side. And going back, you mentioned when we started our talk about another startup. What was that? How was that experience, and where is that right now?
Yeah, I accidentally bumped into my co-founder when studying at university.
Hmm.
I went down a business incubator at my university, down the corridor, and there were identical doors. And I was going to visit a friend who had a startup, so I knocked the door, and then Nicholas, my co-founder, opened up, and I realized I had knocked the wrong door because it wasn't my friend that I was there to see. And so then we started talking. He had already started building a company around an idea of being able to provide summer courses for high school students around the
Hmm.
world. So setting up course centers across Europe, Middle East, and the United States, in whichever subjects these students wanted to improve in, whether it be math or economics or biology. So that's what we built. We had grand ambitions. We managed to build a proper business, but not one that really scaled. So when we graduated from university, it was we had definitely fallen in love with working with learning, but we
Hmm.
hadn't really managed to build the business to the size of impact that we wanted to. So that's when we started looking for other ways of creating that value for students, and ultimately that led us to founding Kognity. So we could use the cash flows from this first business called
Hmm.
Lanterna to hire our first engineers, to build a prototype for Kognity, and to do that initial go-to-market motion and try out ideas. So we were very lucky to have that, which allowed us to not take in too much external capital in the beginning. And of course, by having run Lanterna for 5 years and having done every single possible mistake, we had a backpack of mistakes and lessons with us as we moved into starting Kognity as well.
So Lantern actually led to a lot of learning in terms of startup experience, but also deepened your resolve to do a paradigm shift in learning as a space as well. So I think two things came out of that. So that's great to know. And then tell us about some early days about Cognity, like how was it building it then versus running it now? So if we can do a little bit of a rewind and see where did it start, how did it start, initial challenges, and how you see its progress so far.
Yeah, and I'll rewind all the way back to the early days of Lanterna.
Okay.
It was really a garage startup back then. We found an abandoned office on the outskirts of Stockholm, so we took the tube out and a half-hour walk out to this abandoned office where we set up shop in the early days. We had no money, we had no contacts, we had no experience. We were 21 and 22 at the time. So we just went on by pure grit, I guess you could call it. And again, yeah, we definitely made every single possible mistake. We had a small team right off the bat with other people who were students and who were financed by this generous grants from the Swedish government to keep on studying, which meant we could pay minimum salary. And then once we realized that this is the value we want to create for students, but we want to do it at a greater scale, we started experimenting with a lot of different product setups. So what is now Kognity, the product we have now, is very different from those early iterations. And I think that was one thing that we did quite well in those days, that we iterated fast. We tried things, we shipped it to schools, we were in almost daily contact with teachers and students to show what we were working on and get their thoughts on it. And that's how we navigated to the current product. So there wasn't really one moment of a grand idea, but it was just knowing what we wanted to fix in how education happens, and a deep belief in the capabilities of technology to accelerate learning in schools, and being completely pragmatic and open as to exactly how we were to do it. And then fast iteration, and around 2016 we started getting initial traction. I believe we moved from $100,000 of ARR to 1 million, then the year after to 2.5, and so on. So thereafter we started growing the team quite fast. My daily tasks changed, of course, from being out on the road and selling all the time and updating the website. I was never allowed to touch accounting, but other than that, I think I did the most possible tasks, to instead leading people, and after some time leading leaders of people, and also being the leader for the overall company, with what that entails with both internal communication, external communication, getting everyone on the same boat, setting the path forward. So your role as a founder evolves as the company grows, and there are several steps to take on that journey, which all require different things from you.
Excellent. I have 3 points coming up. So great in deep dive into the rewind mode. But you at 3 points in this 5 minutes, you talked about fast iteration. And I advise a lot of early stage, like 5 to 700 early stage startups. And I see more and more that the tech startups that I'm meeting and others are meeting, they come up with a very fixed idea of a product and kind of latch onto this and don't let it go. How did you go into a fast iteration mode? How can find founders leave product as a fixed entity and kind of see it as a market, as a response to market evolution or something. Yeah, if we can touch there.
Great point, Nimo. And yeah, people sometimes ask me if I have any advice to upcoming entrepreneurs, and I tend to say exactly that you have to face the truth, however
Hmm.
hard it may be. And I think the most successful entrepreneurs are the ones that are ready to pivot really fast, especially in the early days. I've personally been too married to my initial idea, to my initial model, and I see this a lot in early stage entrepreneurs as well, similarly to your observations. And in reality, it's quite rare that your initial idea is what will actually take you to proper scale.
Hmm.
That's very rare. There are a few examples, but more often than not, you change around several times and you will need to reboot several times. I'm primarily thinking about product, but also around culture and how you structure your team and your overall setup. You will need to reboot all of this a number of times to be successful. So you have to work through these reboots. And then the question is, do you do that series of reboots across 5 years or across 1 year? And if you do it across 5 years, you've wasted 4 years of company potential. But if you manage to do it in 1 year, then you're poised to grow really fast. And you just need to have that mindset, I believe. I don't think it's anything else than that. Be completely open
Hmm.
to what actually works. Put no prestige into the ideas that you've sold to the people that joined your team, to investors, to your friends,
Hmm.
to your spouse. That stuff doesn't matter. Just be pragmatic about how you can create the impact, how you can create the scale. Let go of all preconceptions you've had. Experiment, work really close to the market, to your customers, and keep on changing until you find your way.
Excellent points. Again, going back to the community here, Hugo rates a very, very important point, and I love the way you have put it: reboot versus pivot. Because I think pivot is a very mild word, it doesn't put that level of pressure. So, reboot in terms of product, culture, or whatever you are doing, like sales approach, because market is constantly evolving. So you need to, so reboot, I think, is a great word to put it there. Can you do fast reboots as startups as you go out? That's one. And second thing that you talked about, instead of being personally attached to an idea, to being pragmatic and building it as a company. So I think excellent words over there. I'll move to the second point I noted when we did the last series of Rewind Talk, and that's where ho- so when do you know, or when does a gut feel develop that you are on to something that can scale big? Did you have that kind of a feeling sometime during the Cognity's building journey? And when was it that you actually felt, okay, this can go that way, and that way is quite big?
We tried to also test product market fit by doing
Mhm.
actual sales all the time
Okay.
during the early iterations, and we managed to sell some of it in the early days to non-informed customers at low deal values. But we had a school I think it was March 2015 or April 2015, so 7 years ago, when we had kept on iterating the product. We started repositioning it a bit more as interactive textbooks, which we've since abandoned because we built out the product significantly since then. But that was a new way to position the product.
Mm.
Um, and we had, of course, matched that with how we built it. But I kept on just traveling around the world, trying to convince schools to try it, and then and together with a colleague, and then in the same month, more or less, we had two deals worth 10,000 euros of ARR come in, and that was a bit mind blowing to me back then. Someone actually wants to pay us $10,000 every year to use what we built. And if two do it the same month, and then we had like two or three more coming the next month, that means we built something that is really valuable to not just one person, but to several people. And we'll have hundreds of students actually using this to learn with. It's actually quite clear when you really have product market fit. I think a lot of entrepreneurs who have never experienced it before try to convince themselves that they have it. I know I did it. But once you actually have it, things take off fast, and you can sell with a repeatable sales model profitably. Deals come flying in. You start being able to finance headcount in an easy way. It's really like the entire company shifts gear.
Okay, great. Very inspiring. So product market fit and actually your cash register singing. That's the indication when things are going to fly. Um, you talked about that you were traveling markets and like an evangelist building your startup story around, and you also talked about that being a CEO means that you need to deep dive into things in several potential areas, build things in a startup which is an early stage. What's the most important thing in your view for CEOs to focus on, and how the yeah
In the early days,
yeah
it's really only about finding product market fit.
okay
Nothing else matters that much. Of course, you should spend some time building a foundation for scale when it comes, but you don't have to build any scalable processes or structures or get the right CRM system in or whatever it is. Don't spend like too much time on anything else but finding a product that really fits the market, meaning one that customers really want and are ready to pay for, and that you can sell to those customers profitably. That's all that matters in the early days, and you have to do whatever it takes to get there. You can
okay.
forget more or less everything else.
It's a product market fit. But another pain that startups have in early stage is that you're very young. Your sales are going to take time till you bring the product to the right level and all. How do you go about funding? Like what worked for you in building your startup on the funding side? And is there any learning you can share with the startups out there? Like if you are going to be raising capital while you're also building your product, your team, and validating everything with the customers, how does the cash keep on moving in? Yeah.
It is quite different depending on your business idea, but most business ideas aren't. It's not necessarily that expensive to reach product market fit,
Okay.
because if it's really there, you don't need a lot of fancy features. You don't need great UX. You just need a product that delivers the core value that the customers are after. And of course, you need to fund that somehow. Either you know how to code yourself, and if it's a software company, or you can build a product yourself, and you can finance that by just living on oatmeal for a year, or you have to bring in a team, and either you make them co-founders and make them live on oatmeal, but as well, but you give them equity, or you find someone who can put in some seed money. But I do think that there's this notion among early stage entrepreneurs that once you start a company, you start looking for funding. Is that actually what you need? Maybe it is, but in some cases it's not, and then you shouldn't spend time on it, because fundraising, even seed fundraising, pre-seed fundraising, early stage fundraising, typically eats at least 50% of your time and at least 75% of your focus. And again, the only thing that really matters in the early days is whether you reach product market fit or not. I think there's a tendency to just spend too much time on it, and if you can avoid it, that's great. And similarly, when you do it, just grab money if it's on the table. Don't go out shopping to 30 investors, build advanced decks. If you can find someone to put in money, so you can focus on getting the company in order, then just take those money.
Great advice. So you're eventually building the company not for the investor, but you're building it for the customer. That should stay in the focus, and build it fast. achieve the PMF, product market fit, as soon as you can. Do it cheaply and take whatever. So stay simple. Don't put 75% of your time. That's what I'm hearing from you on fundraising. Rather, use that time to move to the market fast. So really, great advice over there. If we switch a little bit, our talk to the area where you're building your startup, Cognity, and your initial startup, why learning? What pulled you into learning as a space?
I guess I might have always had some level of interest in working with learning, and I've always loved learning myself. My mom is a teacher, so we've always had those conversations at home. But I think also just a lot of coincidence that I bumped into Nicholas behind that wrong door in that corridor now 12 years ago. He was already working with this, and I thought it sounded like a lot of fun. And since we started those, since the initial business model was to build these core centers and have actual students come into those core centers, and we'd be out there all the time. We would meet these students face to face, and we were almost the same age as they were. So we formed really strong relationships with them and formed bonds. And they came in struggling in their subjects, often with a low level of confidence. They had the ideas that they would never understand math, or that they could never get into university X or Y. And then we could both help them with conceptual knowledge, but also in reestablishing a belief in their own ability to do what they actually want to do. And that's a huge thing for someone to all of a sudden realize I can go so much further than what I thought. And that elicits feelings and a sense, I think, of gratitude that we were exposed to. And feeling that in those encounters with students just made us think that this is so much more fun and rewarding than going into management consulting or finance or whatever else it was that was hot at the time. So definitely the encounters with students we had in those early days made me a lifelong fan of working with learning, of improving learning, just understanding what kind of impact it has on the individual. And then, I guess on the back of that, intellectually starting to think about what role does it play in society, and what impact can it have on society. If we look at at many of the biggest problems in the world, conflicts, prejudice, populism, so many of them are tied to education levels. So hopefully we can, beyond creating impact for individuals, we hope to also, by raising learning efficacy, to be able to have an impact for societies and the world as well. We won't do it on our own, but we hope to be able to play a significant part in it.
Great thoughts. And I think if you catch on, my mother was also a teacher. So I've had that thing. And I think it's a huge satisfaction when you're building a business for impact, because that satisfaction binds you even. So every day in and out, you are bound stronger with the vision that you are behind, or which you are propagating, because the impact that you make on a daily basis, it eventually leads you, okay, I'm on the right track. So that's great to know. And education is a great space, I think, to also build not something for the running generation, for the coming generation. So that's where the impact eventually lands into. If you build a 10-year-old into, so you are talking about 70 or 80 years of that thing going into the and transforming the next generations as well. How is it tough building an impact startup as opposed to a regular B2B SaaS startup or something? Just asking that question. There is a huge explosion in the impact space in the last 5-6 years. We have seen in Stockholm, Nordics, and rest of the world. And is building an impact startup any different from any regular software startup or something? And how does it feel like?
Some aspects are very similar, some are quite different. And those differences sometimes makes it sometimes make it harder and sometimes make it easier.
Mm.
If we start to look at the markets that we operate in, we sell to schools. Schools are typically slower moving than privately owned companies.
Mm.
Or publicly owned companies, but they are slower moving organizations because there is so much red tape and regulation around them, which means that the actual sales process can be slow and difficult and harder to make profitable.
Mm.
So that's one challenge that we have. We've managed to sustain high growth in spite of that, but it's something that we constantly have to work with. But a general advantage of building an impact-led company is that a lot of people want to work with something that has a positive impact for the world. If you are an engineer or a salesperson or an accountant, doesn't matter. Would you rather be working with invoicing solutions or a tool that improves learning for the world's students? I think a lot of people find it more inspiring to work with a tool that improves learning for the world's students. That means that we can really recruit amazing team members to Kognity. It's a huge advantage on the talent market, and it's a differentiator. So that's probably, I guess, also a bit rooted in my belief that nothing is more important than the team and who is on the team. Who do you manage to attract? How good are you at selecting really great people to fill the needs that your business have? So, and since that's the number one most important thing, and you get an advantage if you're an impact business, I think that's the biggest difference, at least in my eyes.
Okay, great. So, which means that when you are on the impact road, the momentum that you're building, it'll attract positive movement. So people are attracted, partners are attracted. So it's because an alignment with the vision is much easier to do because you're working on something meaningful. Great. Coming to some advice to our entrepreneurs out there, based on the experience that you have had, what do you think is the hardest part about running a tech startup?
There's maybe I should split that answer up in what's hardest emotionally and what's hardest with making it successful. Emotionally, it's always the single hardest thing is to let go of people that you really, really like and that you think that you know can be great, but it's just not the right fit. That's the hardest thing, and you have to do it. You have to be able to do it. And we've parted ways with some amazing people at times because it simply just hasn't been the right match. And we form quite strong bonds with each other at Kognity, and it's just an emotionally tough thing to do. In terms of making it successful, probably the constant leveling up that you need to do as a founder CEO. You have to constantly expand your perspectives, how you go about doing things, your behaviors. It's not so much about learning the technical skills or becoming better at whether it be Excel or presentational skills or what have you. It is really about how you change and evolve as a person in your behavioral patterns, because it's tough to change on that level, but you need to do it all the time in order to keep on growing yourself in the business.
Interesting. How does one switch off from business? So, business, like if you are an entrepreneur and you are building your idea, the idea has been around. So, every time, even sleeping, going to sleep, you are on with the idea where this is going. How does one take space out for oneself in all this process as an entrepreneur? And is it important?
Yeah, it is important. I don't think there's a single founder who doesn't struggle with this. there are numerous studies who show that mental health goes down quite significantly after you start a company. So it's nothing that you want to do for happiness, but even if your happiness may be adversely affected at times, it gives you a sense of purpose that I think compensates for it. But of course, you have to work with this very actively. You have to work with your mental modeling around it. You have to learn that whatever chaos is happening, it's just another one of those. It's another event similar to what has happened thousands of times before, maybe not at your company, but in other companies. If everything is on fire, you're on your way to running out of cash, you have to let one person go or an entire team go. There's a fight among shareholders that's really ugly. Whatever it is, it has happened lots of times before at other companies, and people survived. No one died, and I think that's just important to remind yourself of. Beyond that, definitely also need to employ specific strategies to make life sustainable. It's around sleep, exercise, work time, flexibility, vacation, what you spend your time on, who you spend it with, all those things. You have to be very conscious about it. With sleep, that you brought up specifically, definitely give yourself the opportunity to sleep minimum 8 hours every night. Given the high pace and the level of stress that you experience in your day-to-day life, you need to optimize for that, and you need to say no to other things to optimize for that. And for me personally, exercise and specifically running has helped a lot too. I've pushed some other things aside. I have a much smaller social circle than I did before I started a business, and now it's 12 years ago. During this entire time, I've had a much smaller social circle than before, and that's just one of the costs that I have to live with, and that I'm comfortable with living with. You won't have time for everything. You have to identify, as we talked about, what in your work takes energy, what gives you energy. Try to refocus your work on what gives you energy. Try to delegate anything that takes energy. There's 1,000 things, and that's one of the areas that you constantly need to evolve in as well.
Great points. I'd like to go a little bit deeper on external positionings for entrepreneurs as well, because of course there's a hustle culture out there. There is thing like there's a pressure for entrepreneurs to perform, and then social media has opened up our lives where you need to you are pressured to show what you are doing by peers because other entrepreneurs are doing it. Do you give in to that like, should as an entrepreneur give in to a pressure like that and start putting up posts like, we're hustling, this is the time, 11 o'clock in the night working on? So how do you draw limits, or is it impossible to do in today's world for an entrepreneur to draw external limits on how they position themselves? Yeah.
I think specifically on what you mentioned there, we try to do the opposite. We try to encourage sustainable work-life patterns, both among our employees in terms of what HR policies we have, how we communicate, and what we put emphasis on when we communicate, to show that it's okay to go to the gym in the middle of the day. It's okay to do the errands. You shouldn't always be available. Make sure to prioritize your well-being and do what it takes to feel that you work sustainably. And that's what we try to project outwards as well. It's not always possible to adhere to, but that's what we try to push. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, that's a great point. I think it builds back to where we started when we talked about visions, values, and cultures. Eventually, what kind of an animal you are trying to build out of your startup? Like, what's you believe in? Eventually, you can shape or mold your way forward. So I think that's a great point. As a founder, or as a founding team, or as a group building a startup, define how you would want to work on this journey. and that relates back to the culture, like giving time to each other, giving time to your own selves, and all that. So it's a great point over there. Where do you think early stage entrepreneurs go wrong mostly, where and the startups end up being not so successful? Majority of startups are not successful, when a very thin minority eventually ends up scaling and reaching those big statuses which media loves to cover. So where do those entrepreneurs go wrong? Yeah. And how can you increase your chances of success, if that's a mirror question?
I have to go back to what we talked about with constantly rebooting everything,
Okay.
and also rebooting your founding team. You may need to have tough dialogue with co-founders, and if you realize that you're misaligned or you don't work well together, you have to cut it. You have to find a way of
Mm,
cutting it, whether you go off to do something else or they go off to do something else and retain some of their shares but not all. However you solve it, you need to cut those relationships, and you need to cut your emotional ties to whatever your initial concept of an idea was, and be ready to iterate close to the market. That's the most important thing.
perfect. I think that's a great point. Like rebooting, going back to rebooting or rebooting to the rebooting stage, but also checking the energy flow, checking your relationship with your co-founding team, and realizing very early if this is going to work in the long run as a team. So, and then kind of readjusting and aligning on the vision, which of course, even when we were talking about at a scale up stage, even at an early stage, alignment with vision is crucial to get there. Great points, Hugo. If there are any questions from the community, we can take them now. Else, I think we have had such an interesting, such an insightful talk. I'll just like to show the paper, like how much data points came out of this talk. So, but it's really good to get your opinion on several stages of the startup journey, on several hard and soft points of building the startup as a team or as a founder, and especially knowing how your role as a CEO or as a founder evolves over time, and where priorities shift, where you need to shift gears. So, Hugo, I'm really thankful for your input and your talk today. It's really generated a lot of interesting ideas. I've had some questions which I received over here, which I've tried to build in our flow. But I'd like to thank you a lot for joining our Startup Grind talk today. Got one question
Thank
from
you, Naim.
Sudeep.
You
Let's
have
take
one
one
question?
question. Yeah. What advice do you have for a B2B SaaS startup that also wants to sell to enterprises, team accounts?
Just that B2C and B2B are two very different worlds,
Mm,
where in a B2C space, you essentially need to build it product led. There's no other alternative, unless you have a really high personal, you have very high cost position. But two different worlds in terms of go-to-market strategies. It's either product-led growth, or it's building up a sales team with everything that entails. I don't know if there are a lot of companies that have been successful doing both from the get-go. My very general advice would be to just choose the one with the most potential and go for that and skip the other. We went for both in the early days with Kognity. We sold to both individual students and to schools. But then that created a lot of debt in the code, in the product model, in the organization, a lot of alignment difficulties. So we just killed off the consumer product and went with our B2B strategy instead. So that would, without knowing the context in your specific
yeah,
business, that would be my general advice.
great, great. Uh, yeah, second. Yeah, great that you love the company. Great. Okay. Thank you, Hugo. Thank you so much for today. And thank you to our awesome community out there who were part of it. We'll be putting this session online as well for those who could not join us. And don't miss our next week's talk with the managing director for Techstars, because they are launching their accelerator. They have launched the accelerator. Their admissions are closing in a week's time or so. So let's catch up there. Thank you, Hugo. Have a very, very good weekend, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, and thank you all for calling in and listening in as well.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.